Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar.
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammadil Fatihi lima ughliq wal khatimi lima sabaq. Nasirul haqq bil haqq wal hadi ila siratika mustaqim wa ala alihi haqqa qadrihi wa miqdarihi al-azim. Rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wahlul 'uqdatan min lisani yafqahu qawli. Subhanaka la 'ilma lana illa ma 'allamtana innaka antal alimul hakim. يا همة الشيخ اهتدي لنا بهذا المحضر وانتعت في بنظرتي تأتي لنا بالظفر. Alhamdulillah. So, mashallah, welcome to the class on the adhan, how to perfect the adhan. Today, as I mentioned just a moment ago, we'll aim to go till about 10 to 6, inshallah. And we'll be covering first, the most important thing is the correct pronunciation of the adhan and all the phrases in it. And so that'll be the bulk of the time, making sure we have that and going over any common mistakes, mentioning those. But then also as an introduction before that, we'll say a few brief words about the adhan and about some of the hadiths on the topic and the merits of it. And then finally ending with some of the recommended acts and etiquettes around the adhan. MashaAllah, alhamdulillah. So the adhan is first of all, for me personally, it's something close to my heart, because as my story goes in terms of my journey to Islam and my conversion, it was really the adhan that brought me to Islam. The first time I heard the adhan, I'd heard a few things about Islam before, but I'd never really seriously considered it. But that adhan, just hearing it, touched something in me. Just kind of echoed throughout my head for the next few weeks, and made me think, there's something here to this thing. And so the adhan is something very close to my heart and something that I love to do. Does anyone know what adhan means? Adhan, the literal meaning. No?
Cool.
You just did the intensive, man. You should be all up on this.
No, well, yeah, I was thinking about the root letters, like what, can I figure out what the exact meaning is from the root? But not really.
Okay. What is the root then? Anyone? 3 root letters.
To
please, to allow, to permission.
Right. So the root is Hamza, Dal, Noon, Adhana, which has several meanings. One is Adhina, Ya'dhanu. Al-Idhan is to allow, to give permission. And also Udhun is another word related to that. Udhun is ear, because we hear the adhan, right? And one of the reasons is that it's related to idhan could be said that it gives us permission to pray. And really adhan, literally, adhan in the Arabic means an announcement in general. And obviously announcing that the prayer time is in, or that the jama'ah, the gathering, is about to happen soon for the prayer. And so we find this root mentioned several times in the Quran. When it's directly mentioned, this adhana, it has different meanings in general, announcements. So, for example, we find in Surah At-Tawbah, ayah 3. We find a mention of making an announcement for a breaking of treaties. There was going to be new treaties between the Muslims and the non-Muslims. And the word used there is adhan, as well as in Surah Al-Hajj, Ibrahim alayhi salam is told to announce the Hajj to people. Ayah 27, adhin fin nas. But then without the specific word adhan, the act of the adhan is mentioned several times in the Quran, so therefore the adhan itself is considered to be an undeniable part of our deen, undeniable part of our religion. Because, for example, in Surah Al-Jumu'ah, ayah 9, we find أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم يا أيها الذين آمنوا إذا نودي للصلاة. O you who believe, when the prayer is called to, إذا نودي للصلاة, when the prayer is called to, and then goes on to saying what we should do in Jumu'ah. So it shows that there is a call to prayer. And then as well there's an ayah in Surah Al-Ma'idah, ayah 58, that mentions how the Jews and the Christians, when they hear the prayer being called to, they make fun of it, because some of them thought it was just it was kind of an ugly sound, mashallah. And so that's the Quranic basis for it. Then in the hadith we find there's a sahih hadith in both the collections of both Imam al-Bukhari and Imam Muslim, rahimahullah, may Allah have mercy on both of them, in which the Prophet is reported to have said, alayhi salatu wasalam, peace and prayers be upon him, إِذَا حَضَرَتِ الصَّلَاةُ فَلْيُؤَذِّنْ لَكُمْ أَحَدُكُمْ. So when the time for prayer comes, one of you should announce it, or one of you should make the adhan. This is a sahih hadith in both Bukhari and Muslim. And then there's a full story too of how this happened. It was in the first year of the Hijrah. The Muslims were all gathered in Medina, and they started noticing that it was somewhat hard for everyone to tell what time it was and tell exactly when the prayers were going to be held, because everyone wanted to join the Prophet ﷺ and pray with him in the mosque, but it was hard for people to tell exactly when. So the Sahaba, the companions of the Prophet, peace be upon him, got together and started discussing what should we do. We should have some kind of announcement. So a few people first said, let's have a gong or some kind of bell. The Prophet ﷺ heard them say that, and he said, that's what the Christians do. He didn't like that. Then someone else said, well, how about we have a trumpet? And once again the Prophet ﷺ said, well, that's what the Jews do. He disliked that. Someone else said, how about we hit a drum? And he said, that's what the Romans do, the Byzantines. He didn't like that. A fourth option, someone said, let's light a fire, and then people will see the fire burning, and they'll know it's time for prayer. And he said, well, that's the way of the fire worshippers, the Majus, and he didn't like that. A fifth option was offered, that how about we raise a flag, and so people will see the flags out and they know it's prayer time. They can just look out and see the flag. And this wasn't mentioned connected to any specific community, but still the Prophet ﷺ said he didn't like that. So all the companions, radiallahu anhum, may Allah be pleased with them, saw that the Prophet, peace and prayers be upon him, was really reflecting on this and trying to think about it, and other companions were. But they didn't come to any conclusion that day. That night, it's reported that Abdullah ibn Zayd, radiallahu anh.
So they're in Medina now, or this is?
This is all Medina.
Oh, okay.
It's the first year of the Hijrah.
Okay.
Yeah, they're all in Medina. Yeah. So Abdullah ibn Zayd, radiallahu anh, has a dream in which an angel comes to him and basically tells him, this is how you announce the prayer. And he goes through the whole thing, the whole form of the adhan, which we're familiar with. And then he woke up the next day and told the Prophet ﷺ about this dream, and several other people had similar experiences, and the Prophet ﷺ reported that this was what he was given to. And so he told. It was said that in the narration it just says that this is what revelation corresponded to. So he might have received the dream. He might have just, maybe Jibreel alayhi salam told him something. It's not quite clear. The details aren't quite clear. But this was what the Prophet had been ordered to do too. And so at that point he went to Bilal radiallahu anh, and told Bilal how to make the adhan. And Bilal was the first one to make the adhan. Interesting point too, that it said that Bilal actually had a problem pronouncing the adhan. He had a speech impediment, whereas he couldn't say the sheen properly. He could only say seen. So when he got to ashhadu, he said ashhadu la ilaha illallah, ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah. And later on, some of the companions came to the Prophet ﷺ and complained about this, that he wasn't pronouncing it properly. But it's reported that the Prophet ﷺ said that Allah has written his seen as a sheen. MashaAllah. So there are also several virtues listed for the adhan. One, it's reported that the Prophet ﷺ said that if people knew the virtue of being in the first line of prayer or calling the adhan, they would enter a lottery for it, if that's all they could do. That was the option that they had. They would cast lots for it. And so it's something that we as believers should be striving towards. As men trying to be in the first line, women preferably in the last line of the lines of women. Then for the men trying to give the adhan and beating everyone else to it. Some of the scholars say that this is one case in which normally as Muslims we're taught to favor others over ourselves. And some scholars say except in matters of the akhirah, except in matters of the hereafter. So it's said that one should never, if there's room in the first line or if a line ahead of us, no, it's best not to say, oh, you go ahead, you go ahead. It's best to beat everyone else to it and try to get there. Obviously, right, with respect and not pushing anyone away. But this is one thing in which we shouldn't favor other people over. We should rush to do these things. It's also said that the ones who give the adhan will have the longest necks on the day of resurrection. This will be a distinction of them that they get in the next life. And there are a few other hadiths related about the favor of this. One other narration which we'll mention, that the Prophet ﷺ made a specific supplication for the people who lead the prayer and who give the adhan. He said, "Oh Allah, grant forgiveness to the people who call the adhan and guide the people who lead the prayer." And finally, it's also reported in a narration that he said, calling the adhan for 70 years will grant one freedom from the fire. May Allah save us all from that. So as we said, the most important thing is making sure that we have our pronunciation straight. So this is what we'll go through, inshaAllah, now. So the form of the adhan. The first thing that we say is Allahu Akbar. So everyone say after me, Allahu Akbar. Akbar. Auntie, if you want to be where you can see the board too, please feel free to. Oh, you can. Okay, mashallah. Okay, just wanted to make sure. Okay, so this one is a phrase that we use all the time and we hear all the time, and yet there is a way to perfect it. So for one thing, a common mistake is to in the Arabic there is a hamza that comes between u and a. So something that we might hear is Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. But what we're doing there is it's like adding a W in between the U and the A here, which is not a proper pronunciation of the Arabic. It's Allahu Akbar. So making sure to have that glottal stop in between the U and the A. Allahu Akbar. Not Allahu Akbar, but Allahu Akbar. Say that after me. Allahu Akbar.
Allahu Akbar.
Great. Another mistake too, and this is especially important in here, but now throughout all of the words, is making sure that we don't extend the short vowels like they're long vowels. So the way I transliterate the Arabic is with a long dash over the long vowels. So you can see that here we have one long vowel in Allahu. So for this, it's for all of the long vowels that come in the adhan, it's permitted to extend it, to extend those long vowels, but not the short vowels. So sometimes we hear people saying Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. This actually changes the meaning quite fundamentally, because when we go Allahu Akbar in Arabic, that we're actually adding an to the beginning, and that means, is Allah great? Is Allah greater? Allahu Akbar, right? So we want to avoid that. And as well, sometimes we hear people extending the last A as well, going Allahu Akbar. That again, it's not correct pronunciation. The one thing that we can extend is the in Allahu. Then finally, and this is not quite a major point, it's a fine point, but if we're interested in really perfecting our pronunciation, it's important for us to take this into account. That the best Arabic Fusha fluent pronunciation we can have is that which will match the Quran. And one important principle of the Quran is that there are heavy letters and there are light letters in the Quran. So Sad, Dad, Ra, Ghain, Kha, Ta, Dha, these are all heavy letters, which means that when specifically Alif or Fatha comes after these letters, it sounds like Ah. It sounds like ah and not a. In all the other letters it sounds like a, which is why we say, for example, one of the there are two letters in Arabic which we find in the Quran. One is Sad, Sad. We don't say Slad, right? Same. And then, for example, Qaf, Qaf. We don't say Qaf, Qaf. And similarly, Lam. We don't say Lam. It's Lam. So we have to pay attention that we're distinguishing between when the a sound should be a and when it should be a. And really the distinction is when this alif or fatha, when this a sound, so translated as a or a with a line above it in the English transliteration, when this comes, it should only be a if it comes after a heavy letter. So lam in Allah is a heavy letter. Hence we say Allah. This is normally lam is not a heavy letter except in the name of Allah. So the lam, so that's why we say Allah and not Allahu, right? So we say Allahu, but note that this fatha does not come after a heavy letter. And so to really pronounce, to perfect our pronunciation of the divine name, the beautiful divine name, we would say Allahu, Allahu. Try that for me. Allahu,
Allahu,
Allahu.
Allahu.
Right. Normally, because we let this lam affect what comes before it. So often, what we say is Allah, Allahu, and that's acceptable. But to perfect the pronunciation is Allahu, Allah, Allahu, Allahu, and then we get to the next one. Note, we have two A's, two fathas, neither of which comes after a heavy letter. So to say this correctly, it would be Akbar, Allahu Akbar. Try that after me. Akbar.
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 Now it's tricky because we want, when we have the ra there, the ra is heavy. So we want to let that affect the fatha, the a that comes before it. Our tongue wants to say Akbar, but to perfect the pronunciation we would say Allahu Akbar. Akbar. So one more time, say after me. Allahu Akbar.
Allahu Akbar.
Great.
Are you not pronouncing the ra, or?
No, you are, but you're distinguishing it from the fatha that comes before it. So it's slight. Akbar. Akbar. Do you hear that ra? Me saying it? You yeah, you hear it.
Like
it's a sukoon on it, right? Because you're stopping on it.
Yeah. So Allahu Akbar.
Right. Akbar. Akbar. Try, so one way to work on this, it's tricky at first, but one way to work on it is to imagine that ra isn't there and just say Akbar, Akbar, And that's what it should sound like. Akbar and then ra. Akbar. Akbar.
Allahu Akbar.
Okay, that's without the ra.
Akbar.
Mm-hmm.
Allahu Akbar.
Yeah, that's getting it. It takes some practice, because you want to make sure that that fatha is clear from being heavy, but you also want to make sure that ra is really there, and the ra is heavy.
I heard, I mean, especially at Lighthouse, like you get all different types of adhans being called here,
Right.
as you know. But whenever I used to hear you do yours, I just chalked that up to like your. I thought that was like a British thing. I thought that like that because I always was like the way he says the ra at the end, like I don't, you know, but so that's the correct way though. Okay.
Right. If we're really serious about correcting our pronunciation, right? Right. We will give every letter and every vowel its right that way. Right. Okay. So next comes. Okay. So now we have ashhadu, ashhadu,
Ashhadu.
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 So on this one, one common mistake we sometimes hear is not quite saying the ha that's here. So it's ash and then ha. Hadu. Sometimes we hear people saying ashadu, ashadu, as if the ha is not there. But that is a ha in the Arabic, hence sh and then h. Ashhadu, ashhadu, ashhadu. Another common mistake that we hear in several phrases of the adhan is when there is putting a slight vowel when there's no vowel. Putting a slight vowel when there's a sukoon, when there should be a sukoon there. So especially I sometimes hear it here where some people will say ashahadu, ashahadu. Between the sha and the ha they add a ashahadu. No, just ashhadu, ashhadu. And then ashhadu Allah, Allah,
Allah.
Allah,
Allah.
ilaha.
On the Allah, is it the feta or the hamza or the alif, the beginning, is that a light in the same way that Allahu is?
Yeah, this lam only in the name of Allah is the lam heavy.
Okay, so down.
So here it's just Allah, Allah,
Okay,
Allah.
the first one is the same. Allahu, Allah.
Right. This is a separate word. This is a separate word. It's actually in the Arabic. It's two words combined, an and la, and they get absorbed to become Allah, Allah. Then ilaha,
Ilaha.
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 Then illa,
Illa.
illallah,
Illallah.
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 So here we note that this lam is not heavy, but this lam is heavy. So we hear illallah. So illallah. So this a and that a sound different. Illallah, illallah. Right. And then we want to make sure that that the ha is there too. Illallah, illallah.
Illallah.
Right. 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 So now after me, the whole thing. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah.
Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah.
One more time. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah.
Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah.
Good. Good. And make sure to go. Yeah, this is just a short vowel. So illallah, illallah. Right. Okay. So the next one, once again we have ashhadu. Okay. So now once again, ashhadu, and now it's anna Muhammada, and then so what happens here is in the Arabic it's Muhammadan, but the n gets absorbed into the ra that comes after it. So the way that we actually pronounce it is Muhammad al-Rasul, Muhammad al-Rasulullah. So these words are getting absorbed into each other, because technically in the Arabic, noon gets absorbed into ra as part of proper tajweed pronunciation, and then the hamzat al-wasl in Allah goes away. So we have ashhadu anna Muhammad, making sure that in our beloved Prophet's name, that we give him his right in saying Muhammad. Anna Muhammad al-Rasulullah. So say that just from Muhammad after me. Muhammad al-Rasulullah.
Muhammad al-Rasulullah.
One more time. Muhammad al-Rasulullah.
Muhammad al-Rasulullah.
Good, right.
Allah.
Rasulullah.
Rasulullah.
Right, the Prophet of Allah, the Prophet of God. Right. Peace and prayers be upon him. Common mistakes here is that, so in this particle, this anna here, grammatically means that there has to be an A sound right here. This is a technical point, because when we just say Muhammad Rasulullah, and we don't have anna in front of it, it's a U, it's a dhamma. So without saying ashhadu anna, if we just say Muhammadun, we say Muhammadun Rasulullah, Muhammadur Rasulullah. So some people, that gets ingrained in them, and so therefore when they come to the Shahada and put ashhadu anna in front of it, sometimes we might hear them saying anna Muhammadur Rasulullah. They might think that's correct, but it's not. The correct is ashhadu anna Muhammadar Rasulullah. Once again, making sure that this ra doesn't make this fatha, this A, heavy, because it comes after a light letter, the D, the dal. Ashhadu anna Muhammadar Rasulullah. Next, we have so first, making sure that we have a proper ha comes from the middle of the throat, which we might have to work on if we're native English speakers. But hayya, hayya,
Hayya.
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 Once again, ha is not a heavy letter, it's a light letter. So make sure we're not saying hayya, hayya, but hayya, hayya.
Hayya.
Right. And then so hayya ala salah. So the sad here is heavy, but that's the only thing heavy in this whole phrase. So the only thing heavy, the only vowel affected by that will be the a, the fatha, after the sad here. So hayya ala salah, ala salah. So this one needs to be light, and this one should be light too. So ala salah,
Ala salah.
ala salah.
Ala salah.
Right. Unless we pronounce, we do our Quran in Warsh, in the Warsh reading of Quran, when you have a lam after a heavy letter, that heaviness gets carried through. So Moroccans, North Africans, you'll hear them saying Hayya ala salah, which is acceptable for them. If we recite in Warsh, then that's the rule that applies. But most of us recite Quran in Hafs and Asim, which is the most common way of recitation that we hear and that we're exposed to. So in that case it would be Hayya ala salah, ala salah. Right.
Ala salah.
Ala salah.
Ala salah.
Right, and making sure that we have a good ayn there. So, yeah, approximated by this little almost superscript C. Ala salah. Ala salah. Right, and then finally, a common mistake that we hear is that sometimes we hear people making this final H, this kind of H, so making it's a ha in the Arabic, but sometimes we mistake it for a ha. So you might hear people saying ala salah, but that's wrong. It's just a soft H. Ala salah, ala salah. The same kind of H that's in the name of Allah. Allah. But then next, in the next phrase, and this is why it's easy to confuse these two, or to confuse this kind of H. Because in the next phrase, it ends with the different type of H, the ha. So, Hayya ala al-falah. After me, Hayya ala al-falah.
Hayya ala falah.
Hayya ala al-falah.
Hayya ala falah.
Good, good. And then one common mistake sometimes we hear too is in this L, in this lam. Sometimes people, I sometimes hear this of people wanting to extend that and say Hayya ala al-falah, but don't. It's just one lam. Ala al-falah, ala al-falah. Right. And then finally, once we're done with that, then it returns once again to Allahu Akbar. And then finally, without the Ashhadu an, we have La ilaha illallah. La ilaha illallah. So this is the form of the adhan. Now we have something extra for the adhan of Fajr. The adhan of Fajr, there's another phrase for us to take into account, which is exactly. Prayer is better than sleep. So, as-salatu, after me, as-salatu,
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 khayrum.
khayrum.
It's originally khayrun, but then the noon gets absorbed into the meme, so the way we pronounce it is khayrum minan nawm. Now this whole thing, khayrum minan nawm.
Khayrum minan nawm.
Khayrum minan nawm.
Khayrum minan nawm.
Right. So, better than sleep. Prayer is better than sleep. And then finally, we also wanted to address the Iqamah in this class. The Iqamah is closely related to the adhan. Anyone know what Iqamah means?
Exact word.
Take a guess.
Oh. I mean, just to call everyone to the salat. I mean, that's the root kaf, meme, and hamza or something.
Close. The root is qaf waw mim. Qaf waw mim, or some say qaf ya mim.
Right.
Iqamah literally has several different meanings. One is to establish, to take up. So the most common time we hear this in the Quran, we hear it over and over again. Allah says, "O you who believe, aqimu as-salah wa atu zakah." Establish the prayer. Aqimu, it's the same word. Iqamah is the noun from that of aqimu, or those who establish the prayer. Alladhina yuqimuna as-salah. Afwan, alladhina yuqimuna as-salah. Right. So it means to establish, or literally also one other meaning, to make stand. So one shade of meaning is that when someone calls the Iqamah, that's when now everyone's going to stand up in the masjid in the mosque to come to prayer. Other words on this root, mustaqim in the Fatiha, same root, seeking straightness, seeking uprightness, mustaqim. Qayyim comes in Surah Al-Bayyinah, meaning upright or guiding to something right. Kutubun qayyimah. So this word we find several times in the Quran. Right. So the Iqamah, there's a phrase that's added in the middle of it, which is so the phrase is, the prayer is being established, or the prayer has been established. The prayer has started. قَدْ 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 قَامَتْ
قامت
قَامَتِ الصَّلَاةِ
قامت الصلاة
قَامَتِ الصَّلَاةِ.
قامت الصلاة.
And another note too, anytime we see an I here, that's a kasra. That's a kasra in the Arabic. Perfection of pronunciation is making sure that that kasra is not just an I, but it's a full I in the proper tajweed.
It's long.
I. It's not long, but kasra pronounced properly is I. There is no I sound in proper pronunciation of Arabic. So alhamdulillahi we say, not lillahi, right? So similar here, ilaha, not illaha, or illallah, illallah. So here, قد قامت الصلاة, قد قامت الصلاة.
قد قامت الصلاة.
قد قامت الصلاة.
قد قامت الصلاة.
Common mistake sometimes that we hear is someone sometimes adding a vowel after qad. Sometimes we hear people say قد قامت الصلاة, right? It's just قد قامت الصلاة. قد قامت الصلاة. Sometimes people also confuse the T and the D, the dal and the ta. Sometimes قد قامت الصلاة, something like that. Making sure that that those are distinguished is best.
Do it with the dhamma, so it's could قامت الصلاة.
Right.
I don't know where I got that from.
Right. قد قامت الصلاة. Exactly. So this is the form of the phrases of the adhan. How we put that all together, the standard adhan will go through this order. So it will have Allahu Akbar 4 times. This is the standard adhan that we hear. Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, and then everything up to here, everything up through Allahu Akbar, the second Allahu Akbar, twice. Right? So Hayya, going through each phrase twice until we get to Allahu Akbar, and then once La ilaha illallah. So just to reiterate or to go through everything, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah, Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah, Ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah, Ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah, Hayya ala salah, Hayya ala salah, Hayya ala al-falah, Hayya ala al-falah, Allahu Akbar, La ilaha illallah. And that's the standard adhan. Now there is a difference of opinion on this. So for the Maliki and the Shafi'i school, it's said that it is for them there is something called tarji', which means that they say the 2 shahadas. It's recommended in the school because this was said to be the practice of the people of Medina, who inherited this from the companions of the Prophet ﷺ, that they would say softly in a voice that is still audible to the people directly around, but not in a loud tone. They would say the 2 shahadas first. So it would be Allahu Akbar, and then Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah, Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah, Ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah, Ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah, Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah, Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah. So going through the shahadas, each one twice.
Like 4 times.
Right, so each one, right. So saying the shahadatain, the 2 shahadas, softly, each one twice, and then again each one twice in a loud voice now. This is considered recommended in the Shafi'i and Maliki schools. And then also another difference of opinion. In the Maliki school, instead of saying Allahu Akbar at first 4 times, they say it's recommended to do only twice. So just Allahu Akbar, then once again they do it's recommended to do the tarjih, Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah, Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah. And then saying both of the shahadas in a loud voice. Then finally, too, when we have this phrase, as-salatu khayrun min an-nawm for Fajr, that goes after Hayya al-falah. So in Fajr, Hayya al-falah, Hayya al-falah, as-salatu khayrun min an-nawm, as-salatu khayrun min an-nawm, Allahu Akbar, la ilaha illallah. And if we leave it out, it's fine. It's still an acceptable adhan to leave out. And then finally, now for the standard Iqamah, adding qad qamati salah now after Hayya al-falah. Typically the standard way that we hear it is each of the takbirs, so Allahu Akbar and the Allahu Akbar down here, each one twice, and the qad qamati salah twice, and everything else once. So the standard way that we hear this is Allahu Akbar, Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah, Ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah, Hayya ala salah, Hayya ala falah, qad qamati salah, Allahu Akbar, la ilaha illallah. Once again, there's a difference of opinion. In the Hanafi school, it's recommended to pretty much do the whole adhan, the whole form of the adhan again, except add qad qamati salat wa alaykum salam. Except adding qad qamati salat. So for them, it's Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah, Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah. So everything twice, and the first Allahu Akbar 4 times. Unlike the other schools, which are pretty much everything once, except for qad qamati salat, which is twice. Now for the...
I'm sorry, say that again, just because I felt Hanafi, so...
Yeah.
So... The Iqamah and
the
the
Iqamah
adhan are basically the same.
Exactly.
Except for 2 qad qamati salat, qad qamati salat.
Exactly.
Wow, okay.
Exactly.
Okay.
And for the Malikis, finally, there's a difference too. They only say, in that school it's recommended to only say qad qamati salat once. Because this is the foundation, that in the adhan everything is twice, and in the Iqamah everything is once. So they say even qad qamati salat, even though the other schools say do this twice, in the Maliki school, only do it once. Is that clear? MashaAllah. So there are several etiquettes listed for perfecting the adhan properly, and we're going slightly over our planned time, but we started a bit late, so MashaAllah. So for one, first of all, the general ruling on it, there is, if we look into the fiqh books, there is really nuanced opinions on exactly what legal classification this is when, if you have a group of Muslims, or if it's a person alone, a group in a masjid, all these different things. In general, it's considered sunnah mu'akkada. It's an emphasized sunnah. So something that we should all do, and if we're, in general, if we're praying a prayer in which other people could possibly join us, it's good to do the adhan. So it's not recommended if the adhan has already been called, if there's already been an established jama'ah, established congregational prayer. But otherwise, it's best to do it. Other recommendations.
What about just like in the house with like, you know, your family, your like immediate family?
So for that, many will say, some will say, yes, do it. I think the important thing is to keep in mind, wallahu a'lam, but the most important thing is just that this is an announcement of prayer, and 2, it's a powerful form of dhikr too. So it gets everyone kind of in the mode of the prayer, and so even though maybe it might not be legally recommended, why not do it, right? And it's a sunnah too. So it's not something that we have to get so detailed about. I mean, if we want to, we can look into all the details of the madahib, of the different legal schools.
And even if, like, say, you're going to leave the salah, then you do the adhan also, or...
Even if you do the salah, if there's a chance that other people could join you, it's a good idea to do the adhan, right? And it's said too that the person the person who calls the adhan regularly or who wants to call the adhan, it's up to them to decide when to do it. But as for the iqamah, it's up to the person who's leading the prayer to decide when that gets called. And preferably the one who does the adhan does the iqamah. So preferably someone will give the adhan, and then they won't, anyone can, if it's time for prayer, then technically if there isn't an established person who's doing an adhan, or the adhan isn't established, called at a certain time, then anyone can give it, but then the imam should give the signal for the iqamah to be made. So there are listed conditions that we should keep in mind for doing the adhan. One is that according to most schools, that the intention is there. We have the intention to call the adhan. Also, that all the words happen in succession, that there's not a break between them. Another one is that it's done in Arabic, but it is mentioned in the books that if the person calling it, and if the person calling it is not an Arab, and the people around who would hear it are not also would understand that language, then it's acceptable for it to be in another language. It's listed. It's said in the book, so that's said to be acceptable for us to do it, say, in English, if we're in an English-speaking country. But of course, we also want to think about the big picture too, in terms of really staying close to the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, having kind of that spiritual draw away from into a spiritual language that we have with the Quran, that kind of thing. Once again, for those people who've entered in the past few minutes, sorry, we're just going a few minutes over with the adhan class. We'll be finishing in the next few minutes, inshallah. Other conditions that are listed are that it's done after the time has entered. One should not do the adhan before the time has entered. There's a difference of opinion now about Fajr. Many scholars say that it can be recommended to do the Fajr adhan early, especially during Ramadan, to wake people up and let them know. And then some say that it should then be repeated when Fajr actually comes in. But other than that, it should only be after the time enters. Also, one condition is that the person who gives the adhan is the same person. So it's not one person says Allahu Akbar and then another one says Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah. That's technically, according to several scholars, not considered a valid adhan. It is valid to, sometimes in some countries, like for example in Damascus, I've heard it, you hear several people giving the adhan, but they're all giving it either all at the same time, or they all kind of say it themselves. So one person will say Allahu Akbar, then another person will say Allahu Akbar. So each one of them is giving his own full adhan, so it's acceptable. Though it's considered, some consider it an innovation, but it's still considered acceptable because each one has their own complete adhan. There are conditions for the person giving the adhan. That person should be Muslim, should be rational, and so capable of reasoning faculties, should be male, and then finally some list an extra one of being baligh, or being of proper age, so the age in which salah becomes incumbent, which prayer becomes incumbent. The main reason for being Muslim and sane, having sound mind, is because this person, the person who gives the adhan, everyone relies on them to let everyone know when the adhan is happening. So you don't want someone who doesn't care about the religion telling you when the time for prayer comes in, unless it could be said to be acceptable. Some say when there is a Muslim who they rely upon the time for, but once again, now we're getting into details that we don't really quite need to go into. And some scholars, particularly it's said, some scholars of the Hanafi school mentioned that these conditions are not completely conditions for validity. So if someone who is non-Muslim or non-male, a woman, gives the adhan, technically it's not fulfilling some of the conditions, but it's still an accurate adhan. Other schools would say this is not an accurate adhan. Now it's preferred that the person giving the adhan is in a state of major and minor purity. that they're able to pronounce the Arabic well, that they have a good voice, they're able to raise their voice. It's preferred for that person to be facing the Qibla, but the more important than facing the Qibla is that the people who are going to hear the Adhan can hear it. So if someone is standing in a place and wants to make sure people hear the Adhan, and in front of them is the Qibla, but everyone who could hear it is behind them, then it's best for that person to turn their back to the Qibla so that people can hear them. Although, to a certain extent, that's kind of a moot point for us these days, because most of the time we have microphones or we're in small spaces, that kind of thing. And so it's best to be reciting facing the Qibla. One other thing some scholars mention is putting the index fingers in the ears. Some mention the reason for this is to make it easier for the person to concentrate on their voice and project their voice more. And then another recommendation is on saying Hayya ala salah to turn to the right when saying Hayya ala salah, and when saying Hayya ala falah to turn to the left. And 3 of the 4 schools, so with the exception of the Hanbalis, say that this turning should be only with the face and the neck. The chest and the legs and everything else, the torso, should remain facing the Qibla. It's ideal. Just to turn the head. So sometimes we see brothers turning their whole body. MashaAllah, it's fine, but it's not. It's said to be preferable to have at least the chest and the whole rest of the body, except the neck and the head, facing the Qibla while we turn on the Hayya ala Salah and then Hayya ala Falah. And then finally, now it's recommended for the person hearing the Adhan to basically repeat the words of the Adhan when they hear them. And so saying Allahu Akbar after Allahu Akbar, after all these phrases, repeating the phrases themselves, but after Hayya ala Salah and Hayya ala Falah, saying La hawla wa la quwwata illa billah. Because that person responding to the call, they're not saying come to prayer. Literally this means come to prayer, come to success, right? But that person responding, it's recommended they say La hawla wa la quwwata illa billah. And some say actually after Hayya ala al-falah to say Ma sha'allahu kan wa ma lam yashan lam yakun. That whatever Allah wills happens, and whatever He doesn't will doesn't happen. And after as-salatu khayrun min an-nawm for Fajr, saying sadaqta wa barart. Sadaqta wa barart. You have spoken the truth, and you basically you have spoken the truth. Sadaqta wa barart. After as-salatu khayrun min an-nawm. And then it's also, though it can be hard to do, it's also recommended to respond to the Iqamah as well. So saying the same kind of thing after the Iqamah, but when the phrase قَدْ قَامَتِ الصَّلَاةِ comes up, saying أَقَامَهَا اللَّهُ وَأَدَامَهَا. أَقَامَهَا اللَّهُ وَأَدَامَهَا. May Allah establish it and make it continue. And finally now, if anyone wants to look into more, there are more details that we're not able to cover during this time, and more recommended. We've covered the basic things, but one final thing is now saying after the Iqamah, there's a recommended phrase to say, which the Prophet ﷺ taught us to say. He said, ask for intercession for me after the Adhan. So it's recommended to say Allahumma rabba hadhihi ad-da'wati at-tamma was-salati al-qa'ima ati Muhammadan al-wasilata wal-fadila wab'athhu maqaman mahmudan alladhi wa'adta innaka la tukhlifu al-mi'ad. Some add that extra phrase, innaka la tukhlifu al-mi'ad, some don't. And in general, just making salawat on the Prophet after the Adhan has been called. It's said that the Prophet ﷺ said إِذَا سَمِعْتُمَ الْمُؤَذِّنَ فَقُولُوا مِثْلَ مَا يَقُولُ ثُمَّ صَلُّوا عَلَيْهِ. When you hear the person calling the adhan, say what he says, then make prayers upon me, ﷺ. And it's also listed there's said to be a great reward on just prayers on the Prophet ﷺ in general during that time. And this is why sometimes we hear people, even the mu'adhin himself, giving the adhan and then saying salawat on the Prophet. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad, Allahumma salli ala Muhammad, something like that, which some say is recommended to do to remind everyone of this recommended act of sending peace and prayers upon the Prophet after the adhan. So with that being said, are there any... one thing I neglected to mention too. It's recommended that the most say that the adhan should be long and extended, and one should leave space in between each phrase for someone to repeat, to respond to that adhan, which is why we normally the adhan lasts long. But then for the iqamah, to say it without those spaces, to say it quite quickly. Except in the Maliki school, for them, the adhan and the iqamah are pretty much at the same at the same pace, and it's said to not really extend the adhan. And one more note: it's best for it to be beautified, but not in a showy way. We should always give the adhan in a way in which it really is a reminder of Allah and of our obligation to Allah, and not a reminder of myself or my showy voice or that kind of thing. So we should always be aware of that if we're ever giving the adhan, aware of the effect that our voice has on people. If people are coming up to us afterwards and saying, "MashaAllah, it's a great adhan, subhanAllah, hey, yeah, you're really good at that." We should be careful, because ideally we should be in a state, and other people should be in a state, when we give the adhan, if I'm giving the adhan, then I look back and I see everyone just turning to Allah and seeming to be connected to Allah. That's the ideal. So may Allah allow us to beautify our worship of Him, perfect our relationship with Him and everything that leads to that. May He forgive me for any mistakes that I made in this class. May He guide me and the rest of you to the best. May Allah give us Allah. May He give us the best in this life and the next. رَبَّنَا آتِنَا فِي الدُّنْيَا حَسَنَةً وَفِي الْآخِرَةِ حَسَنَةً وَقِنَا عَذَابَ النَّارِ. And then finally we say what we find from the Prophet ﷺ, saying to do the expiation of a gathering to save us from any sins that we've committed during this gathering. Subhanak Allahumma wa bihamdik, ashhadu an la ilaha illa ant, astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk. Alhamdulillah. Jazakumullah khair. Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah. Ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah. Ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah. Hayya ala salah. Hayya ala salah. Hayya ala al-falah. Hayya ala al-falah. Allahu أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله اللهم رب هذه الدعوة التامة والصلاة القائمة آت محمدا الوسيلة والفضيلة وبعث المقام المحمود الذي وعدته فإنك لا تخلف الميعاد اللهم صل على